Star Trek Voyager, Starfleet Academy, Quarantine, Chapter 5. Kathryn knew why they called it the Great Hall. The room was about the size of the Tsiolkovsky's shuttle bay. It was filled with benches and cots, pillows and blankets, a food table, and a few barrels filled with drinking water, not to mention dozens of sick tubes. The walls of the great hall were dull gray, adding to the somberness of the surroundings. The window that led to the government complex occupied one wall. It also held the communications panel and a camera that monitored the inside of the great hall. A food table rested against the opposite wall. A side wall had a long line of cots for the sick tubes. The opposite wall had a sealed door with a tiny scratched and yellowed window and a single small crystal window that overlooked the outside of the dome.
This is the closest I've come to the outside of the dome, Kathryn thought, and me without my tricorder.
Grabbing a piece of bread and a cup of water from the food table, Kathryn walked over and sat down with the other cadets on a wooden bench. As she chewed on the bread, she let out a frustrated sigh. For about an hour, she and the other cadets had been walking around the great hall trying to ask the Chtube questions. Many of the Chtube were lying on cots, their foreheads covered with what looked like a dark powder. Others, even though they were shivering and sick, were trying to clean the hall or tend to the ill. But no matter who the cadets tried to talk to, they were ignored, with many of the Chtube turning their backs on the cadets. Kathryn felt as if they really did have a plague of some kind, and she didn't know how or why. I think we should be finding some way of talking with Governor Nima, said Blinar, taking a spoonful of porridge from a bowl. As he chewed, he made a face and looked down his bumpy nose at the bowl. This tastes like Legellian grubs. What do you have against the Legellians, Blinar? Asked Marie, biting into what looked like a yellow carrot. You keep making references to them. They are the people who live on the moon that circles my home world, he said. We didn't get along too well until the Federation came along. The Legellians would often trade with the Romulans, he said, practically spitting his words, his ears twitching, and old habits and sayings die hard. Arrgh. As Kathryn took a sip of water, she noticed an older female Chtube wrapped tightly in blankets and lying on a cot. Squinting her eyes, she tried to see the woman's face. She looked like the old woman who had disappeared, but Kathryn couldn't tell in the dim light. She stood up and slowly approached the cot. Okay, sorry. Go on. Okay, sorry. Go on farther. The deep, low tone of the voice stopped her, and she felt a hard broom handle between her shoulder blades. When she turned around to face the voice, she recognized him immediately. He was the tall male Chtube with the scar who helped her with the communications panel. His spiked white hair was shorter than most of the other Chtube males she had seen, and it moved only slightly as he talked. He wore a thin black sash around his waist and carried a brown leather pack on his shoulder. It is not wise to threaten a member of Starfleet, came another voice. Blinar pushed the broom handle away and stood as close as he could to the Chtube. Laswa, Timothy, and Marie were suddenly standing behind Kathryn. The Chtube laughed loudly. And what do I care about this Starfleet? He replied, sneering at Blinar, his blue eyes opening wide. You should care, replied Blinar, his eyes squinting. The Chatub moved closer to Blinar and pointed to his face with a long, thin finger. You know how I got this scar. It was a short being, just like you, who...
Blinar, and whoever you are, said Kathryn, moving between the two. I think calmer heads should prevail here. We're all in the same predicament, right?
She watched as Blinar and the Chatub continued to glare at each other. She turned to the Chatub.
All right, go ahead. Tell me fighting is going to do any of us any good, and I'll be the first one to do it.
The Chatub looked at Kathryn in surprise, then turned to the female Chatub on the cot. It's fine, Lane. Let them talk with me, she said, holding her hand out in Kathryn and Blinar's direction. Kathryn tilted her head. She expected the woman's voice to be weak and feeble, or even for her to talk rapidly like Governor Nima, Captain Nimoy, whatever. Instead, her voice was strong, soothing, and seemed almost musical, as if, no matter what adversity surrounded her, she would always speak that way. Kathryn extended her fingers in a Chatub greeting.
Cadets Blinar, Laswa Rana, Mary Lacu, and Timothy Wang, she said, introducing the others. And I'm Cadet Kathryn Janeway.
I am called the Zahn, the woman replied, moving slowly to a sitting position, not returning the greeting. She waved her left hand in a circular gesture toward her covers. Please excuse the blankets. The beginning signs of the plague include being cold. Kathryn felt herself move away from the Zahn, then moved back again.
I'm sorry. I've never been exposed to a plague before.
The Zahn nodded. This is new to my people, too. We have long been without the plague, but now, like a silent snake in the grass, it sneaks up behind us, she said, twisting her long fingers to move like a snake. She looked wistfully around the room and sighed. These are my people, Cadet Kathryn Janeway. I am their leader, and I feel as if I have let them down. Leader? Said Laswa, puzzled. Governor Nima is leader. Yes, of his people, she answered. We are called the Chatub, but our people are divided into the Chats and the Obers, interrupted Blinar, remembering his lesson from the captain. Yes, the Obers represent almost half the population. We are the original culture of this planet, she said, clasping her hands together. And who should rightfully rule the planet? Muttered Lane. Kathryn noticed that he had started sweeping the floor nearby, but was still listening. The Zahn gave Lane a swift look, and turned to Kathryn, suddenly looking tired and sad. Lane is my second in command, and these Obers around us are the ones who have contracted the Cillian plague. I can only hope the Obers in the other domes have not yet contracted the disease. The plague started in this dome 2 moon times ago, and we've heard nothing from them since then. Timothy scratched his head. You really don't look different than the Chats. How are the Obers different? Lane made a sweeping gesture with his hand. The Obers speak slowly, and with their hands as the ancients once did. Chats speak as rapidly as machines they used to speed up their lives. We are simple. They surround themselves with riches, and they sniff the air to show disgust, mostly of the Obers. And something you can't see on the outside, added the Zahn, holding up her right hand as if trying to hold something back. For some reason, the Obers cannot resist the plague, but the Chats can. She looked at Kathryn and tilted her head, her blue eyes widening. I truly hope you were all immune. It would not be right for you to carry such a burden.
This is really all my fault, Zahn,
said Kathryn, looking back at the other cadets.
I was following an elderly woman, and the others just came along with me.
She looked around the room.
And I still don't see her here.
Lane seemed to almost bark, the biting sound causing many of the obers to turn in the direction of the cadets. That was no ober you saw, Cadet Kathryn Janeway.
He's probably right, the Zahn said to Kathryn. The woman was a chat decoy to get you to enter a yellow room and contaminate you with the plague.
She folded her arms across her chest and curled over.
Many of us, she whispered, including me, were fooled into following not only elderly women, but sick children into the plague room.
But why us? Asked Marie, still looking pale as he nervously scanned the room. We were doing them a favor by bringing in the medical equipment. The Zahn looked up, her wide blue eyes seeming to burn into Mari.
So that's what you were doing. But don't you know, it's the government's way of contaminating you in hopes that the obers are not the only ones who can catch the plague. They're hoping that your species will catch the disease just to...
The Zahn turned from the cadets and began to cough uncontrollably. Pushing Kathryn out of the way, Lane rushed to his leader's side and began to shout orders to several other obers, his arms waving rapidly.
Can we do anything?
Kathryn asked, looking over Lane's shoulder as he pulled out a bunch of leaves from his pocket and put it on the Zahn's forehead. He shook his head furiously, and Kathryn could tell that Lane was almost feverish himself, with fright. Kathryn looked at Blinar and shrugged in response. She moved closer to the ober, helping Lane hold the leaves to the Zahn's head.
And what are the symptoms of the plague?
She asked softly.
First comes a bone-deep cold, like the kind you feel in the middle of snow time, and along with it a fever, he said. Then there's fatigue, as if you have been up for days without sleep. The blisters come next, and you don't want to know the rest.
Kathryn saw Timothy and Mary shiver out of the corner of her eye, and could easily understand why.
This is good coffee. There's coffee in that nebula.
Okay. Chapter 6. It was night time, and Blinar, Timothy, and Laswa were trying to get comfortable enough to sleep on the hard wooden floor. A soothing light came from two of the Chatub moons shining in the singular crystal window, but Kathryn didn't care. Marie was lying on a cot, shivering from an unseen cold. First sign of the plague. A few hours before, he seemed to be all right. While Blinar stood in front of the Great Hall monitoring camera, Kathryn, Laswa, and Timothy tried to take apart the communications console on the wall, but to no avail. Right when Laswa managed to pull the covering off the console, Marie collapsed. Kathryn sat on the edge of the cot and stared down at her shivering friend, remembering Lane's words. The bone-deep cold, like the kind you feel in the middle of snow time. Snow time on Chatub was no doubt similar to Earth's winter, and being from Indiana, Kathryn knew the deep, bitter cold of that season. Mary, who had lived in the northern regions of North America with his people, the Yupiaq, would know even more about winter than she did, and here he was, shivering in the warm room. Don't worry, Kathryn, whispered Marie, looking up at her and trying to smile. I have my bear with me.
Bear?
She asked in a low voice. Marie pulled out a leather string from inside his shirt. On the end was a small black object. He held it up for Kathryn to see.
This bear, my father carved it. The Yapiak, the Yubiak, I can't say my own tribe's name, believe that animals have certain powers. The bear represents strength, so I'll get strong again. I promise, Kathryn, and my bear promises.
He put the bear back inside his shirt and closed his eyes. She smiled and put her hand on Marie's forehead just one more time, hoping the fever would be gone, but it was still there. Kathryn felt powerless and scared. Would she and the others catch a plague just as easily? All she could do right now was sit and wait and depend on the Chat government, the Tsiolkovsky, or just plain luck to pull them through. She wanted to do something, anything, to get them out of there.
If I could just get back to the ship, she thought, maybe I could help Drs. Hess and Tabasa find an antidote.
An antidote? I think she means vaccine. Vaccine. Yes, she means vaccine. Is he feverish? A deep voice whispered behind her, breaking into her thoughts. Kathryn turned to see Lane, his tall forehead furrowed over his large blue eyes. She nodded in reply.
He's been this way for about 2 hours now, she whispered back. I just thought he was tired at first, and now he seems to have a fever. I wish I knew more about medicine, she added, frustrated. Here, maybe I can help, he said, opening his hands. Lane moved over to Marie's side and took out the pack he carried over his shoulder. Kathryn watched as he carefully unfolded a large white cloth filled with what looked like dried leaves. With his long, thin fingers, he scooped into the middle of the leaves and crushed them into a fine powder along Marie's forehead. Wilbab. It's a medicine we grow for fevers. The dried plant counteracts the heat of the body. See the heat it absorbs as it touches his forehead? Kathryn shook her head. No, not really. But your eyes can see somewhat into the infrared, and I can only see visible light with my eyes.
What a shame. There are many wondrous things your people miss seeing, he said, motioning with a sweep of his arm toward the crystal window that led to the outside of the dome. The seas, the sunrises. He turned back to Marie. Maybe your friend will respond to the Wilbab as the Obers respond. Kathryn smiled.
Thank you, Lane, she said, holding out her hand. I guess we really didn't meet under great circumstances.
Lane took her hand and held on, much to Kathryn's surprise. It was not you, Cadet Kathryn Janeway, he said. Lane nodded toward the other cadets, lying on the floor. It was that one, the one called Cadet Blinar. He's always trying to take over. Kathryn knew it was true. Ever since they'd become unwilling members of the Great Hall, Blinar was constantly lecturing to the others. All afternoon he talked to Laswa and Timothy, telling them not to give up, that he would figure out how to get them out of quarantine and back to the Tsiolkovsky. Kathryn noticed that neither cadet really listened.
Like all of us, Blinar is a first-year cadet, she whispered to the Ober. None of us has too much off-world experience, and Blinar likes to think he's in charge. He wants to be a captain of a starship one day.
I've been listening to him talk to the others. His are promises with no results. That is more like the actions of one who is scared, he said, releasing her hand and putting the dried herbs back in his pack. He looked down at Marie. I will check him later. Now I must see how the Zana is doing. Kathryn watched as Lane moved smoothly and quietly through the other sleeping Obers toward the Zon. The older Ober was still awake, but did not seem to be any better. Every now and then Kathryn would see the covers around the Zon's cot start to quiver, and she knew the Ober leader was feverish again.
Kathryn,
said Laswa, pulling at Kathryn's sleeve.
it is my turn. I will watch Mari. You have been watching for 2 hours.
Kathryn nodded and tried to smile at the Hasek cadet.
Thanks, Laswa. I wanted to walk around for a while, see if I can pick up any information. I can't just sit here. Marie's not getting any better. We have to do something.
She looked around the great hall.
And I think I know who can help us.
Kathryn slipped through the cots and stood next to Lane. She watched as he carefully put Wilbab on the Zon's forehead and nodded to Kathryn. She rests.
Good. Lane, I need your help.
My help? I am sorry, but I only follow the orders of the Zon, Cadet Kathryn Janeway, he said, holding his right hand out toward her, then turned back to the shivering leader.
Even if it may mean helping her?
Lane looked at Kathryn, his eyes seeming to flash even in the dim moonlight. She could see that she had caught his attention.
We were trying to reach my ship by modifying the communications panel on the wall when Marie got sick. Now maybe you can help.
How?
You showed me how to use the communications panel when we first arrived. You must know how...
Very little, Kathryn, he said, hesitating. He made a small circle in the air with a long finger and smiled. But I do know something about how the backup communications are installed. Kathryn woke the other cadets and explained her plan. As Blinar and Timothy walked in front of the monitoring cameras, Kathryn, Laswa, and Lane worked on the panel. Lane pointed to several wires while Kathryn and Laswa rerouted the pathway circuits. Try it now, said Lane, pressing a panel. Laswa held several wires up from the wall, then nodded to Kathryn.
Here goes.
She pressed the 2 red templates on the panel.
Cadet Janeway to the Tsiolkovsky. Cadet Janeway to...
Suddenly the panel sent out a high-pitched hum.
Look out!
She yelled. An explosion sent sparks flying into the air. Kathryn covered her head and hit the floor. As she fell, she heard Lane and Laswa also fall hard to the ground. As the panel continued to explode, some of the Obers ran from their cots and mats, their arms flailing wildly, and many of them screaming. Kathryn felt like screaming too. The room was in chaos, and several Obers fell to the floor, pushed by others trying to get away. Even Kathryn was kicked in the leg by an Ober running to the other side of the room. As the noise slowed to a few hisses and pops, Kathryn looked up. Most of the Obers were in a group against the far wall. They were hugging each other and trying to move as far away as possible from the explosion, while Timothy and Blinar tried to calm them down. Lane was grabbing the side of an empty cot, pulling himself up slowly. Laswa was on her knees, coughing from the smoke. As Kathryn pushed herself to her knees, she saw movement in the far window. Standing there was Governor Olnima and 3 of his officials. Governor Olnima pointed to the communications console on the wall, his long spiked hair waving rapidly. He sniffed once and turned to Kathryn, quickly mouthing the words, "Too bad. We'll fix it as soon as we can." He turned on his heel and walked away. "I bet," she muttered, gritting her teeth. She realized that the Chat government was not helping at all. She brushed off her hands, then looked up at the broken, smoking console. Split wires hung out of the wall, and soot covered the top of the panel. Even the monitoring camera was broken and burned. Laswa crawled over to Kathryn. "Kathryn, that panel, it should not have exploded. Believe me?" "I know," she whispered back, pushing some hair off her forehead.
I think it was booby-trapped. Someone doesn't want us to contact the ship or get out of here. But we're going to fool them, Laswa. We are going to get out of here.
Kathryn drummed her fingers on the floor. First, they were cut off from the ship, and now they were cut off from talking to the chats. She may be only training to become a science officer, but that didn't mean she had to sit around like a Legelian grub, to use a saying from Blinar. She knew something had to be done, even if it had to be done one step at a time, and she was going to do it.